So you know that default startup file in Blender, that cube scene? This one? I was using that thing for years before I realized you could actually customize it. But once I did realize you could do that, it was a bit of a game changer. It might seem like a simple concept, but customizing your startup file, it's really the key to unlocking a whole nother level of efficiency within your workflow. So today, I'm going to show you how to move beyond that default startup file as we jump in and explore my setup. Now your configuration, it very well may differ from mine, so don't hesitate to explore other videos on YouTube for inspiration. I've also done this and have used some as reference for this video. I'll provide a few links to those within the description below. But with that said, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Now let's jump on in and start exploring my setup. Now I do want to first quickly touch on why I've chosen this daytime exterior setup as my initial starting scene. The reason being is that I often do projects that involve exterior environments, and it's also both a good neutral and realistic lighting setup. This allows me to quickly test and assess assets as well as use it as a base starting point to build my projects from. Let's start off with going over the workspace though. So first of all, you'll see that I have two shader editors open in the bottom portion of my workspace. The one on the bottom right is set to Object, and then the one on the bottom left is set to World. Now I got this idea from another video on YouTube, and again, I will have a link to that within the description. But the idea here is to have consistent access to the materials within my scene while simultaneously being able to access my world properties without having to go to this drop down and constantly have to switch between the two if I were to otherwise have a single shader editor open within my workspace. Now, from my experience, I do find this most beneficial in the earlier stages of a project. Once I have tested and refined my world, I find that I don't go back to edit it very much. So once I've reached that stage of a project, what I will do is just go here and then join areas and bring that over. And this way, I have more space to work on my materials as I continue to build them up and add nodes to them. But for illustration purposes, I'm just going to drag that panel back over and then set it to World. There we go. And that is how you create new panels within your workspace. In case you didn't already know, you just go up to the top left corner until your cursor turns to that crosshair, drag it out, and then you can just select whatever you'd like from this drop-down list. All right, I'm just going to join that back over. And there we go. All right, so then the top left, I have my render camera active. If you're in your perspective view here, to get back into your camera, you just press 0 on the numpad, and that'll swing you right in there. And now in the top right, I have my perspective view active within this panel. And that's just so that as I navigate around, edit my scene, move objects around or edit the meshes, adjust the materials, I get that one-to-one feedback regarding the changes that I'm making to my scene within my camera view here. So I'm just going to undo that change. And then in the top right, I have my outliner active. And then over here, I have my properties tabs within this panel. So next, let's go over the render settings. So if you click on this render properties tab, that'll bring you right there. And first you'll see that my render engine is set to cycles. That's because I typically use cycles, so that's why I have it set to that. If you usually use Eevee, by all means, feel free to set it to Eevee and then adjust your render settings as needed. My device is set to GPU compute. That's just because it's faster than the CPU, so why not use it? And then if we go to edit preferences system, I'm using a Mac, so I have that set to metal. And then I have it set to Apple M1 Max GPU 32 cores. I have that checkbox just ticked off right there. And then if we go down to the sampling, you'll see that my max samples for the viewport are set to 15. It's kind of a low value, but that just ensures that things resolve as quickly as possible as I edit my scene. And this is especially beneficial if I have rendered mode active in my perspective view as I navigate around, and as I continue to build up my scene and add elements to it. You'll also see that I have denoise turned on, and that again is just to make sure that things resolve as quickly as possible, and it prevents things from looking all noisy, as you'll see here. And when you move around, it just kind of persistently stays noisy, which isn't really a good look. So I'm going to turn that back on. And then if we go down to the render samples, you'll see that my max samples are set to 64. It is kind of a low value, but that just ensures that if I go to my render view here, it allows us to quickly pump out renders and iterate as quickly as possible in the early stages of a project. Once I get into the final stages of a project for final render, I will typically have my max samples to at least 256 or 512, and then I will have denoise turned on. Now, some people like to have denoise turned off and then they rely on samples, or maybe they will denoise their renders in the compositing stages, but I like to just kind of have that ticked off, so I have it turned on. And then if we go down to the light paths, you'll see that the settings here are mostly default. The volume is turned up to 1, but otherwise everything's default. I did test these and I found that these settings worked well enough for me. Whenever I increased the diffuse or glossy max bounces to anything above 4, it was kind of a diminishing return. But when it was anything less than 4, I did start to see a quality difference. And I'll have a link to another video that goes over these in the description as well. So I'm just going to close that up, close up the sampling. And in the color management, I have seen that some people, for the look, have been using high contrast. Now that does create a kind of subtle and nice look within your final render, so feel free to try that out and use it for yourself. I'm just going to stick with none though, as I like to apply any contrast or overall look adjustments in the compositing stages. All right, now let's go to the output properties, and you'll see that I have the resolution set to 1280 by 720. Now that is kind of a lower resolution, it creates a smaller image here, but again, that just allows me to iterate as quickly as possible when I'm starting on a project, which is the point of the startup file. Later on, I will increase my resolution to 1080, and for final output, I will often even use 4K, especially for single frame renders. And then for my frame rate, I have that set to 24 frames per second. It's standard, so it's just there, ready to go for whenever I want to do an animation. So I'm just going to minimize that. And then for my file format, I have it set to Open EXR Multilayer. That's because I like to typically composite my projects. And so that's there ready to go for any kind of multi-pass compositing. Next, I'm just going to describe the overall scene structure and the elements that make up my scene that are within the outliner here. First, you'll see that everything is within a collection, and then each collection is colored. Now I've colored each collection so that I can more quickly be able to identify and select any given collection as needed. I also find that it just helps overall to better organize my scenes, but this is really preference, so feel free to do this or not. But to color a collection, all you have to do is right click on it and then select one of these colored icons here, and it will set it to that color. All right, now I'm going to go over the render camera. So if we just select that, you'll see that it's just positioned over here looking down into my scene. I'm just going to go back to solid mode here. And then if we go to the camera properties, you'll see I have my focal length set to 35 millimeters. That's because I don't typically do product style renders or portrait style character renders. If I did, I might have that set to something like, say, 50 millimeters or even 85. But I find 35 millimeters is a good kind of middle ground focal length to start from, and then I can just adjust it later as needed. And then I have depth of field just turned off. There's no background or foreground objects to be blurred, so I can always, again, turn that on later. All right, next you'll see that within my lights collection, I just have this sun lamp, and it is parented to this empty. And the reason being is that if I go into rendered mode here again in my perspective, so we can get a wider perspective of what's happening, I'm just going to turn off my sun lamp first. You'll see that the HDRI that I have connected to my world here is not only contributing indirect light, but also direct lighting information. And that's because there is a sun within the image up there. And so that is effectively acting as a direct light source within that HDRI. I'm just going to undo that. I just accidentally rotated it. But so I have that empty in there with that sun lamp connected to it, because if I unconnect that and turn on the sun lamp, obviously the sun lamp also has its own direct shadows coming from that sphere. And so what that empty is doing, it's acting as a singular control point that enables me to rotate both the HDRI along with that sun lamp simultaneously, which ensures that the shadows being cast from both light sources stay lined up. I'm just going to undo that, and there we go. And so I've done that by just creating this texture coordinate node, and then I've plugged the object into the vector of the image texture node for the HDRI, which is coming into the background of the world. And then within the object input, I've just assigned that empty, and that creates that connection between the HDRI and that control. All right, next if we go into the geometry collection, you'll see that I just have this ground plane first, and all I've done to create that is just Shift A mesh plane, and then I've scaled it up, and it just has this basic material applied to it with a mid-level kind of gray. Everything else is default, and I've left that color at that mid kind of gray, just so that I can accurately assess the lighting information in the scene, how that indirect light is affecting the shadows, how the light is coming up, bouncing off of the sphere and back into the shadows. If I had it set to something other than gray, say a warmer maybe brown or even a blue or what have you, we wouldn't be able to get as accurate of an assessment regarding how the light is actually affecting the scene overall and the shadows within it. So I'm just going to undo that. And that's why I have it set to that kind of mid-gray color. And then if we go to this sphube here, which is a cube, wouldn't you know it, with a subdivision modifier applied to it. Now, I did try testing out this cast modifier on it as well, and what that does, it just kind of rounds out those edges a little bit more that are kind of visible prior to having that applied. When it's just a subdivided cube, right there you can kind of see it on those parts of the object. But if we apply that cast with the factor set to 1, it fully kind of rounds out that shape and makes it more spherical, which I prefer. However, the downside to that is once you start making adjustments to it, if I just extrude out this face, go back to object mode, you'll see it kind of pops back to that spherical shape, which isn't ideal when you start to model objects from that cube. And so what we can do to prevent that is just disable that cast modifier by default. And then if we ever want to turn it on, it's just there and ready to be turned on. But I'm just going to undo all that, get that back to that rounded shape. And there we go. And then for the material that we have on it, it's just a principled BSDF with the color towards white. Everything else is default. Specular is up to 1. Again, that's just so that we can get a proper assessment of how the lighting is affecting our scene on that object before building it up and adding textures to the scene. All right, now let's go down to the volume box. And I have this volume box already pre-made within the scene because I typically find that I will add volumetrics to my projects. And that's because it does a good job of adding atmosphere and depth to anything that you might be working on. Obviously, you don't want to overdo it, otherwise it'll look like this, which probably isn't what you would always want. So I have it at a very low kind of subtle value to start with, and then I can adjust it later as needed. And all I've done to create that for the material is I've just plugged this volume scatter into the volume with the density at 0.001, and the color is at white. And so that's the overall scene structure and setup within the outliner. And now I'm going to go over the pre-made materials that I've made for my startup file so that I can quickly assign these materials as a starting point to any of my assets. And they're kind of just there ready to go. So let's go over to the material tab. And you'll see here, if I click on the material dropdown, that I've created these 3 pre-made materials so far. And they are an emissive material, a regular PBR matte, and then a PBR SSS. And then I've assigned them all as fake users. And so to do that, I started with this ground plane, one of the materials I'd already made, for example. And then I would just click on this button here to create a new material from that already created material. And then I renamed it and then clicked on this little shield button, which made it a fake user. And you want to do that for these because when I open the scene initially, none of them by default are assigned to any existing object. And so if you close Blender and reopen it, what it would otherwise do is delete those materials. And so to ensure that they stick around, you just have to assign them as fake users, and then they will be persistent every time you open Blender. So the first one to go over is the PBR matte. So it's that one there, which is assigned to that sphere. I'm just going to undo it. What that is, it's just a principled BSDF with the color, again, set to white, everything default, specular 1. And I went over that before already. That's just so that I can get an accurate assessment of the lighting within the scene. And then for the other material, it's a PBR SSS, and that's just a principled BSDF with a kind of orange color, with a yellowy orange subsurface color, and then the subsurface up to 1. And that is kind of a personal preference material to have in there ready to go. It depends on how much you might use something like this. I just like how it kind of describes the light within my scene. It gives the object some depth, and it's kind of just good to test any kind of lighting scenario that I might have in place. The color of it is definitely preference as well, so feel free to, if you do add it, change the color or other properties on it. And then the other material that I have pre-made is just this emissive material. And that's just so that I have this ready to go and apply to any objects in my scene as well. I'm a lighting artist, so I would often use something like this. I just have an emission node plugged into the surface with the strength at 10 to start. Might be a bit high, but that works just to get me going. All right, I'm going to show you how I would typically use the startup file within a specific scenario in this scene here. So I'm just going to turn off that spherical cubey shape there. Then I'm going to pop over to Quixel Bridge in my other workspace. And I'm just going to import this Nordic Beach Rocks asset. Should say it's exported it soon. Let's try that again. It might have just lagged out. 1 second. All right, yeah, so something was up. I just had to close Blender and Bridge and then reopen both of them, and it seems to be working. So I'm just going to import that again, give that another go. There we go, exported to Blender successfully. And so here we go. We can see it now within our scene. It's looking a little bit dark. Oh, that's because I already have one in there. That's why. Yeah, there we go. But now you can see we can immediately assess the asset, how it's looking, how the materials are responding to that pre-made light setup that we have in place, how it's looking overall, and how that ground plane is kind of integrating it into the environment. And we can see those shadows being cast from it. And so what we can do at this point is we can mess around with our lighting a little bit more if we'd like to kind of refine our light direction. We can bring it around from the front maybe. And then we can also just start moving around that asset, rotating it, placing it where we feel like it looks good within our scene, and just start blocking out our scene overall. We can start importing maybe more assets from Quixel Bridge or start building up some of our own. And yeah, that's kind of how I would practically put this scene within my startup file to use in a real world scenario, as it were. But now I'm just going to go into that alternate scene and start discussing how I've kind of built that up. So I'm just going to go over to the scene button in the top and select Studio. So within the studio scene, I've created an environment that resembles a photography studio, as you can see. It's useful for those situations where I might find myself doing character or product renders, and it's also a more efficient alternative to that default startup file. To create this scene, what I did was from the daytime exterior scene, if we just pop back into that scene for a second, I just clicked this new scene button and then selected full copy from that list. And that created a duplicate of the daytime exterior scene, and then I just adjusted it from there. So now I'm just going to quickly describe the overall scene structure and the elements that make up the scene. So first of all, you'll notice that I have 2 cameras now within the camera collection. That original one is just the exact same as that last camera that we were using. Has the same settings, same focal length, no depth of field. And then the second camera, if I just turn that on, you'll notice it's closer to the world origin and the cursor. And that's just so that if I append or link in any assets, be the characters or otherwise, the camera's already in a pretty good position, and it's set to 50 millimeters, so it's already set up for any kind of portrait style character renders that I might be doing. I'm just going to turn that off for now. Now if we go into the lights collection, you'll see that I have various sub-collections of lights along with this top soft box. Now I'll go back into these in a second. But if we go into the geometry collection, you'll see again that I have this ground plane. And to make that, I just extruded up the back edge of the ground plane to create that back wall. And then I also have a subdivision modifier applied to it to create that back kind of progressional curve on the back end of it. Now again, I have that good old sphere in the center of my frame here within my scene, and that is just being used once again to quickly be able to model any kind of objects that I might want to create. And it also allows me to quickly just kind of assess and set up a quick lighting setup prior to implementing other assets or creating any kind of geometry within my scene. I would, though, have this cast modifier, again, turned off by default on it, and then just turn it on as needed. All right, now if we go into the volume box, you'll see again, it's just encompassing my entire scene here. The volume scatter node, once again, is plugged into the volume, and the density is just at 0.005, so it's very subtle once again, and then I can just adjust it as I would like later on. All right, now I'm just going to quickly show you how I would typically use this type of scene within my startup file within a real world scenario. So I'm just going to turn off this guy again, and I'm going to go to File, Append, and then I'm going to append in this David head high object. And you'll see, based off of the initial append, it's quite far from the 01 studio camera. So I'm just going to switch it to the 02 studio camera. And again, that's why I set up that camera in that position. It's already there and we're already getting immediate results without having to create a new camera, position it, set the focal length. It's already good to go. I would just drag that in there as well. And then if we go back up into that lights group, you'll see here, I do have just that single light source active. It's just a area light scaled up to mimic a softbox, creating some soft shadows. And then it's also coming in from the front screen left, creating that kind of Rembrandt effect. And then I also have this hidden light, which is just the same light, just kind of flipped over onto screen right. And it's at the same intensity, and that's just creating this kind of flat lighting look by default. But what we can do here is just use this as our key light, and then we can just reduce the intensity to something, say like 5. And then that'll just now be acting as our fill light, just adding a bit of fill into those shadows. And then what we can do is just kind of flip the roles of each of these lights, where the screen left, if we wanted to, that could be the fill light, like so. And then the screen right area light could act as our key light. And then now we're just kind of getting the same lighting setup just in reverse. And next, if I just turn on these rim lights, you'll see that it's just 2 spotlights positioned behind the subject here, coming in from screen left as well as screen right. And you can use either both of them at the same time, of course, if you'd like, or you can just use one of them at a time. Maybe you want to use the one opposite of the key light, and that can sometimes create a nice kind of look. But that's totally up to you. So I'm just going to turn off those rim lights for now, though. And I'm also going to turn off the front lights, and then I'm going to turn on these side lights. And what we can do then is just move them around as we would like. I'm just going to open up that collection so I can select them easier. You can just move them around as you'd like. Maybe you want them to come from further back. Now they're almost kind of like rim lights, or you can just keep them right around the center there, and that could also work. And again, we can use them similar to how we were kind of testing those front lights, where we can have one acting as our key light and then the other one acting more as a fill light like this. And that could work too. And I'm just going to turn off those side lights. And now I'm going to turn on this one, which is just a area light coming in from the top, acting again as a kind of softbox light, providing that kind of diffused light coming into our scene here. And again, feel free to adjust these as needed. You can increase the intensity or adjust the color however you might like to create different results. So that's how I would typically use this scene practically within a real world type of scenario. So I'm just going to turn that, actually I'm just going to leave that on. Yeah, I'll just leave that on. But I'm going to turn off the David head here and bring back that sphere and then pop back into that 0-1 camera. But yeah, so there you go. So that is how you make a customized startup file within Blender and kind of customize it to your needs. So what I can do now is show you how I would obviously put that into use more directly. So if I could go File, New, General, don't save. Boom, there we go. We already got it. It's ready to go. We have our studio scene here. If we go to rendered mode, everything's working as it should. And then we go to daytime exterior. That's all there, working as it should. And we have a great starting point to kind of hit the ground running. Next, I'm going to show you how to actually save these startup files. So what you would do is just go File, Defaults, Save Startup File. And then what that will do is just save that current state of whatever file it is you're working in as your latest startup file. Now you do want to be careful with this because it will overwrite the previous startup file. So what I would typically do is save new versions of my startup files within a location on my hard drive. And then if I accidentally overwrite my last startup file, I can just go back and revert. This is also useful when you download a new version of Blender. You can simply set your startup file to the last working startup file from your previous version of Blender by navigating to that directory on your computer and then just opening the file within that new Blender and saving it as your startup file. But that sums up this tutorial. So I hope you enjoyed the lesson and I will see you in the next video.